It's the OG Fact Checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. This will be my last episode celebrating Native American heritage and Alaskan Native Month. By now, you've learned about the Navajo Code Talkers and the Sooner Squadron and their contributions to World War II. But I'm hoping you've also noticed the differences between the American tribes I've covered, specifically the differences between the tribes who resisted colonial rule and assimilation and those who didn't. Even I was surprised when I started digging, and I know I haven't scratched the surface on the differences. If I had dug any deeper, I would have written enough material for a 2-hour episode, no lie. I could have gone there easily. I wish I had learned about these tribes in high school or college because their stories are one of migration, settlement, adaptation, and survival using surrounding resources, and anyone can relate to these stories. Their humility and humanity are inspiring. I can't take responsibility for not learning about them in high school, but I can take responsibility for not doing so in college with my electives. Whenever I discover a juicy tidbit of history, I feel inadequate because as a citizen of the United States, I should know these things about our country. I'll be completely honest. I'd probably fail the new citizenship test or even the old one. One of the things that I feel I should know is how Alaska was admitted into the Union and more about its indigenous peoples. Before writing this episode, I didn't know the particulars of how the U.S. bought Alaska, and I knew absolutely nothing about these ethnic groups and how long they've existed. But I did know about their contribution to World War II through my research for other episodes, so I tabled this topic knowing I would write about them for November. You must be thinking, wait, how did a bunch of people so far north participate in a war that took place in Europe and the Pacific Islands? Well, the war wasn't just in those regions. Japan was hell-bent on dominating the Pacific, and after they struck Pearl Harbor, they got cocky and decided to attack the Aleutian Islands located near Alaska. That's when President Roosevelt tapped another existing resource, the Native communities in Alaska. About 6,300 men and women from ages 12 to 80 from the Tlingit, the Aleut, Tsimshian, Haida, and Athabascan communities, as well as the Yupik and Inupiaq people, volunteered. Like any military member, they were sworn in but not paid a dime to be part of the newly and hastily formed Alaska Territorial Guard, or ATG, to safeguard villages and transportation routes for supplies. They were called Eskimo Scouts by the military, but this colonial term is no longer welcome, which is why the title of this episode is Don't Call Them Eskimos. That's offensive. Before I jump into everything, I want to tackle a slight controversy about nomenclature. Yeah, nomenclature, because there's this idea floating around that we shouldn't call tribes from Alaska natives and the tribes in America natives or Indians because they weren't born in the Americas and the term is Indian is racist, yada, yada, yada. And in my research, I've seen terms used interchangeably to the point that I wasn't sure what term was the right term to use. The definition of the word native varies between the dictionaries, but don't differ by much. Merriam-Webster's definitions include belonging to a particular place by birth and living or growing naturally in a particular region. Oxford Dictionary definitions include of a country, region, etc., that is place of a person's birth and early life, that is the place of origin of a plant or animal, and born in a designated place belonging to a particular people by birth, specifically belonging to an indigenous ethnic group as distinguished from foreigners, especially European colonists. The words indigenous and aboriginal have the same meanings, inhabiting a land from the earliest time before colonization. So you'll find me switching between native or indigenous or aboriginal because I'm going by the terms used in the sources. If those entities are fine with the terms, if they use it in their marketing, then it's kosher to use. Before I tell you about the ATG, I should start with the history of Alaska because I wouldn't be giving you the complete picture if I left this information out. Remember, Alaska was the second to last state admitted into the Union. It wasn't part of the Louisiana Purchase, it wasn't part of the spoils of war, and it wasn't taken from Mexico. Yes, I'm about to give you another twisted history U.S. geography lesson. If you remember from episode 21 on the Navajo Code Talkers, I talked about the migration of the Navajo, or Diné, across the Bering Strait land bridge, a land mass that once connected Russia to Canada. Danish explorer Vitus Bering, who was commissioned by the Russian Tsar Peter the Great, confirmed this land mass existed and that people had been regularly traveling and trading across the strait for thousands of years. Actually, Bering made two trips. The first trip was in 1728 and the second one was in 1741. And as a matter of fact, he never returned to Russia. He died in the Aleutian Islands in December of that year. Scientists confirmed what Bering had reported. The first migration, which followed herding animals from Siberia across the Bering land bridge to Alaska, occurred about 15,000 years ago, and that group continued south into the Americas. Those are the tribes and nations like the Navajo that broke off from the Athabascans, which isn't a tribe but a language group. Then there was a second migration, and that migration brought the population that settled in Alaska and Canada. The population that settled in Alaska included the Aleuts, the Athabascans, Inuit, Yupik, Tlingit, and Haida. Today, Alaska has 11 communities that are recognized by their geographic location. In the southeast are the Ayak, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. In the north and northwest are the Inupiaq and St. Lawrence Island Yupik. In the southwest are the Yupik and Yupik. The Athabascan peoples live in Alaska's interior, and the Alutiiq and Uganux people live in south central Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. So the communities were living, thriving, trading, and cooperating with each other. But when Tsar Peter the Great's explorer for hire reported on the possibilities of this new land and the abundance of fox, fur seal, and otter, the Tsar's intentions morphed into fur trading with the Aleuts, who were skilled at hunting sea animals, like the otter, and exploitation of mineral resources beginning in 1745. Then the Russians got greedy and started bribing the Aleut, and in some cases pulled a kidnapping for ransom scheme for payments in fur when they didn't comply with contributing to the supply. Smelling an opportunity, Russians, known as Russian Creoles, began settling in Alaska, specifically Unalaska, in the Dutch harbor in 1772, and set up a permanent settlement at Three Saints Bay in 1784. These Creoles intermarried with those from the Aleut, Yupik, Inuit, and other natives. Like the Navajo, the tribes resisted. The Aleuts wrecked 4 Russian vessels before Russians ended that rebellion. One community in particular, the Koniag, had a Mexican standoff with the Russians when they arrived uninvited in 1784 on Kodiak Island. 4,000 Koniag rolled up strong and told a Russian merchant named Grigory Shilyakov, "You gotta bounce up out of here because if you don't, it's going to get physical." Shilyakov responded with, "Niet, say hello to my little friend," and came in blasting, destroying their community. The Koniag weren't the only ones who fought back. The Tlingit destroyed a fort the Russians had built, and this led to an all-out brawl near the city known today as Sitka. The Tlingit lost and were driven off their lands and relocated to the city of New Arkhangelsk. Once the word was out in Europe about this new land called Alaska, occupied by the Russians, you know what came next, right? The European invasion, started by the Brits in 1778 with Captain Cook. And then the Spaniards in 1779, led by Navy officer Ignacio de Arteaga, and the French in 1786, led by Jean-François de la Pérouse. Spain claimed a small piece at Nunchak Bay as a show of strength, and France tried to claim some land, but the Brits lost the colonies through the American Revolutionary War, and France was dealing with its own revolution, so Russia was the winner by default. The problem with all this invading is that they brought disease, which of course reduced the native population. This hostile takeover in the early 1800s led to the establishment of political districts and brutal methods against the locals to build the fur trapping business. Russia had set up a charter governed by the Russian American Company to basically govern the land and use the natives for labor, much like their country's serf system, even relocating groups of people to an island in the Bering Sea to harvest seal. Because of their greed, sea otters and sea populations reduced significantly, so much so that the company had to put caps on how many fur pelts could be sold. Never satisfied, the company conducted more explorations of the land to see if there were other resources they could exploit. But by the 1850s, Alaska was no longer profitable for Russia. Interest in fur was decreasing, and the sea otter population was practically extinct. Plus, Russia was going head to head with the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War, and they lost their leader, Emperor Nicholas I, who died from pneumonia after inspecting the troops. His son, Alexander II, stepped in, and he was tired of his daddy's costly war and wanted to end it, and he finally did that in 1856. To cut their losses and to focus on the European dogs breathing down their neck, Russia approached the American government in 1859 about the possibility of buying Alaska, basically to piss off Great Britain. America was indeed interested, but they had to deal with the Civil War first. 2 years after the Civil War, America agreed to buy Alaska for $7.2 million from Russia, and the land was officially transferred to the United States on October 18, 1867. The weird part is that for 30 years, nothing was done with the land, and at times it wasn't even overseen by any government agency. Plus, the country was in the Reconstruction period, so Alaska was the least of the U.S.'s concerns. Now, regarding the exploitation of natural resources, the Russians only focused on fur, not minerals. But it stood to reason that there might be valuable minerals like gold and copper because Alaska natives had been using them for trading before the European invasion, but they placed no value on them. Around 1883, an American prospector named Ed Schiffeline found some gold deposits in Tlingit country along the Yukon and 40-mile rivers. To control the prospecting frenzy that followed and then exploded in 1897, the U.S. finally created a civil government in Alaska in 1884. About 100,000 people raided Alaska looking for gold and found it, becoming nouveau riche. This new wealth allowed prospectors to buy land to build boom towns within the Klondike, a territory within the Yukon, like Dawson City. Believe it or not, this rush only lasted 2 years when gold was discovered elsewhere in Alaska and Canada. This hunt for gold nuggets was how the towns of Nome, Fairbanks, and Ruby were created, and was responsible for building the Alaska Railroad in 1902, which connected the towns of Seward and Fairbanks. Those who came for the rush made the territory their home, and by 1939, the start of World War II, 59,278 people lived there. I'm just scratching the surface of how everything went down in Alaska because there are multiple congressional acts that led to where the tribes are now. But here's some basic info for you that just might help you win a trivia contest at a bar someday, or maybe get you a spot on Jeopardy! Alaska, which became a state in 1959, is larger in land mass than the lower 48 states, with 571,641 square miles. Unique legislation for the federally recognized tribes that dictate everything is in place, from how lands are conveyed from the government to when and how tribes, villages, and corporations are consulted. You heard the word corporation, didn't you? I'll get to tribal structure in a minute. In the lower 48 states, there are 245 federally recognized tribes and 325 Indian reservations. But in Alaska, there are 229 federally recognized tribes and only one Indian reservation. Why only one reservation? Ah, that's when the corporations come in. I have to jump ahead a little bit because the establishment of corporations didn't occur until way after the end of World War II. So, in 1966, 400 Alaska Natives formed an organization called the Alaska Federation of Natives. And in this organization today are 151 federally recognized tribes, 192 village corporations, 11 regional corporations, and 11 regional nonprofit and tribal consortiums. The goal of the Federation at the time was to hammer out Aboriginal land rights with the government. You see, when the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia, some of the tribes, like the Tlingit, Tanana, and Haida, cried foul, saying, "Hey, Russia never owned our land, they only occupied it. We've been on these lands for thousands of years. So that sale was illegal as far as we're concerned, and if you want our land, you need to deal with us." The Tlingit and the Haida lawyered up and sued the U.S. in 1935 after Congress passed a law allowing them to do so, and the tribes won in 1959 and received compensation in 1968. However, there's only one reservation, the Metlakatla Indian Community on Annette Islands, 20 miles south of Ketchikan, Alaska. Why are they a reservation? They rejected the deal under ANCSA and opted to maintain their sovereignty. Each region has many smaller village corporations that total 225, and they were responsible for choosing the surface lands around their villages. The result from all this finagling is that if any resources are developed on their land, like minerals, oil, or timber, all shareholders of the corporation profit from it. And from these profits, the corporations can focus on the needs of their communities. You may be wondering how these tribes were so successful with the government. Well, the government had learned its lesson and wanted to try a kinder, gentler approach with recognizing tribal land rights. All right, I'm done with the background on Alaska. I'll shift to how the Alaska Territorial Guard, or ATG, came about. I said in my introduction that Japan was hell-bent on dominating the Pacific, and they got cocky after the attack at Pearl Harbor. In June 1942, 6 months after that surprise attack, Japan successfully bombed Dutch Harbor, where two American bases were located in the Aleutian Islands. Japan marched on to evade and occupy the islands of Attu and Kiska, but the U.S. gave them a fight. This was the Battle of the Aleutian Islands, which occurred from June 1942 to August 1943 in the Bering Sea. Though the U.S. came out the victor, this invasion had the military shook. The U.S. was still trying to recover from Pearl Harbor while at the same time strapping up for war. Naval strategy led to the U.S. taking back Attu Island, but Japan's retreat out of fear of getting bombed was how the U.S. secured Kiska. Why would Japan want these barren islands with no strategic value? Some historians believe Japan seized Attu and Kiska mainly to divert the U.S. Pacific Fleet during the Japanese attack on Midway Island from June 4th to 7th, 1942, in the Central Pacific. It's also possible the Japanese believed that holding the two islands could prevent the U.S. from any attempt to invade Japan's home islands by way of the Aleutian chain. As far as the U.S. was concerned, it didn't matter why Japan did what they did. They were more concerned about a foreign enemy invading and occupying U.S. territory, which hadn't occurred since the War of 1812. These attacks were too close for comfort, and something had to be done. One of those things was the evacuation of 800 Unangan, or Utes, from Pribilof Islands and residents from the Atka village. These people were split between 5 locations secured at the last minute where they stayed for the remainder of the war. Managed by the Department of the Interior, the Office of Indian Affairs, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the voyage and the internments were a nightmare for the refugees. The natives from Atka were deposited at a former herring plant near a Klingit village. Ute from the Pribilof Islands were split and dropped off between 2 locations, a former fish cannery located at Funter Bay on Admiralty Island and another cannery on the same island. The second batch of Utes collected from villages in Alaska were relocated to the Wrangell Institute, a boarding school run by the Office of Indian Affairs. The real interesting part was only the Unangan were removed and relocated to what was called duration camps. As a matter of fact, the orders from the commander of the naval station in Dutch Harbor declared, all natives or persons with as much as 1/8 native blood were compelled to go. Only such portable baggage as the people could carry was permitted. No employee, native or white, of the Seams Drake Puget Sound Company, a contractor responsible for military and naval construction work, was to be carried. Dr. Bernetta Block, a representative from the U.S. Department of Health, was sent to assess conditions at Funter Bay and a report of a measles outbreak. What she saw when she got there was 10 times worse than what she expected. She saw crowded, filthy living conditions with no sewage and no running water. The water they had access to was contaminated. As we entered the first bunkhouse, the odor of human excreta and waste was so pungent that I could hardly make the grade, she noted. She and the other investigators laid their eyes upon mothers and children who shared single bunk beds, huddled together in the damp cold and darkness, and found other children naked and covered with excreta. Funter Bay wasn't the only location with substandard conditions. Cramped, unheated quarters could be found at the other, but not all locations as well, where tuberculosis and flu ran rampant. The Unangan women submitted a petition to the Office of Indian Affairs, complaining about the conditions. We, the people of this place, want a better place to live, the petition began. We drink impure water and then get sick. We got no place to take a bath and no place to wash our clothes or dry them when it rains. We live in a room with our children just enough to turn around in. We use blankets for walls just to live in private. How did the government respond? Basically, they said, suck it up. We're at war. But they later admitted that conditions there probably did make them sick because of foul water and contaminated fish. When the Unangans were finally allowed to return to their villages, they came back to devastation. Whatever personal possessions and sacred religious relics they had to leave behind were either looted or destroyed by the Japanese and Americans. And even though they received $12,000 in restitution from Congress through the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands Restitution Act of 1988, it wasn't enough to replace what couldn't be replaced. Now, the other problem the military needed to attend to is how to defend this region, approximately 6,640 miles of Alaskan coastline from future Japanese attacks. That's when Major Marvin Muktuk Marston and Major Carl Scheibner came in. They were tasked to recruit the natives to defend their villages and towns, and why not? These people were hunters and trackers. They knew the land, were handy with a rifle, and were the best scouts around. Marston had great respect for the natives and wanted to help them defend their lands, guerrilla warfare style. According to Marston's biography, Men of the Tundra, Eskimos at War, written in 1969, the Guard was initially called the Tundra Army, And whites, Indians, Eskimos, and Aleuts were included in the overall plan. Okay, you see the problems in that sentence, right? He's using Indians, Aleut, and Eskimos in the same sentence. Let's break it down. The term Eskimo was used to describe the Inuit and Yupik people. And to put a finer point on it, there are two communities of Yupik, one with the apostrophe, one without. The one without the apostrophe live on St. Lawrence Island. The one with the apostrophe live on the mainland. Not all communities called themselves Aleut, which is more like a blanket term. Anyway, even though Marston got the terms wrong, his dedication to the cause was right. Because of his respect for the people, which included him traveling for miles through the tundra, even on dog sled during the winter, he recruited 6,300 men and women from ages 12 to 80. With the recruits in place, they were issued a rifle, a uniform, snowshoes, and other essential gear, and were trained on Army tactics. Activities included protecting the only source of metal platinum in the Western Hemisphere, securing land around air routes between the US and Russia, which by now had become an ally in the war, creating camouflage to fool Japanese aircraft flying over and practicing blackout drills, transporting materiel, assisting in the construction of airstrips and facilities, distributing emergency food and ammunition to the U.S. Navy, and shooting down Japanese air balloons that carried bombs that were carried on the jet stream onto the mainland, eavesdropping on radio transmissions, and rescuing downed airmen. Guess when the ATG was recognized for their actions? In 2010, 65 years after the end of World War II. President George W. Bush signed into law a bill that gave the ATG honorable discharges and veteran status. The state's Department of Military and Veteran Affairs set up a task force to help those granted veteran status navigate and obtain the benefits they are entitled to. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.